Hello, everybody. This is Mr. Adolf, and we are going to jump right into the next unit on the circulatory system. And we're going to focus on the heart for the most part, but the circulatory system is going to be your heart and your blood vessels. We are multicellular organisms. We're made up of trillions of cells, and every one of those individual cells have a high demand. They need oxygen and glucose and, proteins. They need to be able to function. They also need to be able to get rid of waste. And the way that's accomplished in something like us, where we have trillions of cells, as far away from our heart as our toes and our hands. We get that done with our circulatory system. So we're going to go through a little bit about how circulatory systems have evolved over time, because we have a very advanced circulatory system because we have a high energy demand. We have these gigantic brains, and we have, these large bodies with muscles that have, they're just using up ATP like crazy. So they have a high demand. But that is not true of all organisms. So let's run through. First of all, there are two types of circulatory systems. There are open systems and there are closed systems. The closed system is the better of the two in terms of being able to meet the needs of the cells, but not all organisms have high needs. And, with a more complex system, there's more resources needed. So, if you have an organism that has a lower energy demand, you don't need as complex of a circulatory system. So an open circulatory system is going to be found in invertebrates. And an invertebrate is an organism that lacks a vertebrae, lacks a backbone. So we're going to see things like insects, mollusks, clams, oysters, and some crustaceans, smaller crustaceans like shrimp. Now in this system, we don't have a closed heart and blood vessel scenario. What ends up happening is you have a heart, they do have a heart, but their blood vessels really just dump blood out into the open, into this area called the sinus, where all their organs are. And that is done through the process that we talked about called peristalsis, where one cell is going to trigger the next cell. So if you take a look at this diagram here, you can see in this grasshopper here, you can see it has this system of blood vessels along the top of the body. And what ends up happening is the heart, which is going to be at the top of the body, is going to pump the blood, and the blood's going to kind of just dump out over these organs. And it's just going to bathe the organs in blood. And then through this constant pushing out of blood, it's going to eventually make its way back up again, and you're going to get this very basic version of a circulatory system. Now, that is not going to work for us because, we have large bodies. So the way this works is it's off the idea of oxygen getting into the body. Now, these organisms don't have lungs like we have, so we can pull air into our lungs. We can pull oxygen into our lungs. These organisms depend on just simple diffusion. There's more oxygen outside, there's less oxygen inside, so the oxygen is going to diffuse in. Now, that's obviously going to limit the amount of oxygen that gets in based off of how much oxygen is in the air. So these are going to be in organisms that are smaller because their cells need to be close enough to the outside environment that the oxygen can diffuse in and get to the cells and get them where they need to be. For us, that would not work, right? We're too big. Well, there was a time actually where insects got gigantic, and I know that's this is stuff of nightmares. But if you take a look here, there was a time called the Carboniferous period where insects got huge because the oxygen levels were way higher in the air. So right now, our air is about 20% oxygen. Back during the Carboniferous period, it was about 35% oxygen. More oxygen outside means it wants to get in more, right? So as more oxygen gets into the organism, it can really be able to sustain a much larger organism. So take a look. This is scary. Look at this thing. This is a scorpion, right? So a scorpion, you've probably seen scorpions. They're tiny, but this is a scorpion. This is a ruler down here, just to give you a reference. This is a foot, right? So this is a scorpion from head to tail here. We're talking about almost 2 feet long, which imagine that coming at you. It'd be terrifying. So as long as our oxygen levels stay where they are, we're never going to see this. But, who knows what's going to happen? Maybe one day we'll have giant insects again. Something else to look forward to. Now, a closed circulatory system is the much more effective version of a circulatory system if you want to get bigger than a little insect. So in this, you're going to find this system in, you're going to see it in some very large invertebrates. They're going to need a closed system. But you're going to see this mainly in invertebrates and larger, higher order organisms. In this system, it's closed because the heart and the arteries and all the blood vessels are all contained in one closed system. And this is way more effective because we want to be able to control where our blood goes, right? We talked about this fight or flight reflex. Let's say an emergency occurred and you need to use your muscle. You need to get out. You need to get out of here or fight, fight for your life. You don't want your blood being channeled to digest your lunch. You want your blood to get channeled to your muscles so you can run or fight. And this is how we accomplish this through our closed system. We can regulate where blood goes by either increasing or decreasing the diameter of our blood vessels, and that will pump blood to different parts of the body depending on what we want to use. It also allows us to control the pressure and speed of our blood flow. So for example, again, if we go into a fight or flight response, your heart rate's going to go up. That's going to allow us to pump blood to our muscles quicker to get them the oxygen they need to be able to activate and then fight or do what we need to do. And also it allows us to get big because now we don't rely on oxygen just diffusing in and getting to where it needs to go. We can take that oxygen, put it in a blood vessel, and shoot it out to your foot or to your hand or wherever else and control where it goes. There are 3 types of hearts that exist when you're looking at an organism. There are a 2-chambered heart, a 3-chambered heart, and a 4-chambered heart. So we have 4-chambered hearts. We are, very advanced. But if you take a look here, you can see there's 3 versions of the heart. These are both 4-chambered hearts. But let's get into more detail on that. So the first type is called a 2-chambered heart. And a 2-chambered heart has, surprise, surprise, 2 chambers. One is called an atria and the other is called a ventricle. And the way a heart works, which we'll talk about, is blood comes into the atria, it gets pumped to the ventricle, and then the ventricle pumps it out to the body. Or in this case, in a 2-chambered heart, it pumps it to the gills. So in a fish, fish get pretty big, but for the most part, they don't have a huge demand. They're not super complex organisms. So they're going to pump blood out to the gills. The gills are going to pick up oxygen through the process, same way we pick up oxygen in our lungs. They just have their lungs are on the outside, essentially. And then the oxygenated blood gets sent to the body where it gets used up. Oxygen gets dumped out to the cells. The cells dump off their carbon dioxide, and then the deoxygenated blood goes back to the heart, and this whole process starts again. This works. It works fine. It has some negatives, though. For one thing, it's a smaller heart. It doesn't have as much blood pressure, so it can't push as much blood out with as much force. And it's just a single circulation. So it's effective, but again, it's not going to really supply the organism with enough oxygen and glucose to really get beyond a certain level of complexity. The second type is a 3rd-chambered heart. So now we're getting a little more advanced. So if you take a look here, you can see this is a 3-chambered heart. We have an atria on the right side, We have an atria on the left side, and then we have a shared ventricle in the bottom. And what this does, now we have 2 atria and 1 ventricle. One atria is going to bring deoxygenated blood from the body. So this is blood that got used, right? It doesn't have oxygen. It needs to get oxygenated. It comes into the atria, and then it comes to the ventricle here, and then it gets pumped out to the lungs. The lungs pick up oxygen. That oxygenated blood comes back into the left side now, which gets pumped into the ventricle, and then that goes out to the body where it drops off the oxygen, picks up carbon dioxide, and this whole process goes again. Now, this works. This is an effective system. However, it's not as effective as a 4-chambered heart for a couple reasons. First off, right here, we have a scenario where the deoxygenated blood and the oxygenated blood are mixing with each other. And what that leads to is blood that's not fully oxygenated. So when this blood comes back in from the lungs that has all that nice fresh oxygen in there, it mixes right back in with the deoxygenated blood. So it gets pumped out to the body, and while it has oxygen, it doesn't have as much oxygen as it could have if it had a separate ventricle here. So that's problem number 1. Now this does happen in people. You may have heard of babies that are born with a hole in their heart. That sounds drastic, but what that means is when we get to the next type of heart here, which is a 4-chambered heart, what ends up happening is there's the divider that separates the two sides. There's a hole there, and you get the mixing of blood, and we'll talk more about that as we go through. But luckily, it's an operation that is easy to fix. When the babies are born with this condition, the doctors are able to do surgery. It's still hard. I mean, I couldn't imagine having my little tiny baby have to go through heart surgery, but they are able to fix it. So that's the benefit of medicine, right? The other negative of this one too is by having these 2 pumps connected here at this middle here, that ventricle, it decreases the amount of pressure. You don't have as much pressure pushing out. So the blood doesn't really get out there to the body. You're going to see this in reptiles and amphibians. So organisms that are, they have a high energy requirement, but again, not as complex as we are. And then finally, we have our 4-chambered heart, the premium heart that you could have, right? The best thing you can get. And that's what we got. So, hey, look at us. We're special. And you're going to find these in mammals and in birds. So the big difference here between us and reptiles and amphibians is that whole warm-blooded, cold-blooded thing, right? So we have to produce our own heat, and the way that's done is through our muscles. Our muscles are constantly firing off to keep our body temperature high. Well, guess what? That costs a lot of energy. That's a high energy demand. So animals like us that have this high energy demand of, needing to create our own body heat, we need a little bit better of a heart than a 3-chambered heart. And that's where the 4 chambers come in. So a 4-chambered heart has separated now. We have, essentially, it's 2 pumps. One pump on the right side is pumping blood to the lungs to pick up oxygen. And then we have a second pump on the left side, which has that oxygenated blood that goes out to the body. So basically the way it works is like this. Deoxygenated blood comes into the right side, into the right atria, into the right ventricle. It gets pumped out to the lungs, picks up its oxygen, comes back to the left side of the heart, into the left atria, left ventricle, and then it gets pumped out to the body. Note, that wall there, now we don't have our blood mixing anymore. Our oxygenated blood is separate from our deoxygenated blood. And what that does is it keeps that oxygen level high and allows us to function at that high level. Also, by having these 2 separate sides, now we have more pressure, right? So if you remember that last slide here, that ventricle was a lot larger, so you couldn't build volume and pressure, right? You learned that in chemistry class. As volume goes up, pressure goes down, and vice versa. So with a smaller volume here, you have a higher pressure, and that is able to push blood out at a higher pressure, gets it out to go farther, right? More pressure means it's going to pump farther. So it allows for increased blood pressure, and what that does is it allows us to be able to keep our bodies warm. Now you might be asking yourself, well, why do birds get in on this? What makes birds so special that they can be up here with mammals? Well, birds have to do this thing called flying, right? Think about the amount of energy that goes into sustained flight. Those wings, I mean, if they blow it and they stop, flapping their wings, they fall, then they die, right? So they need to develop this system where they could have these sustained flights. So they also need this 4-chambered heart. So that's just a quick little overview of the evolution of the heart. We are definitely the most complex of the organisms that we discussed here. So we have a very high demand. So we have a very complex heart. Thank you very much. Have a good day.